So my name is, there we go. So welcome to MIRAC's presentation about our report back from the border. My name is Sophie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be presenting with these awesome people.
Hi, I'm Montana. I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Julia. I use she and they pronouns.
I'm Brad, he, him pronouns.
And to start with, we have some.
Are you doing?
And just while you're not eating, if you could remember to put your mask back on, that'd be awesome. Thank you. Okay, so here's what we're going to be chatting about today during our time together. We're going to start with just a little bit of an introduction about who's MIRAC, what is this trip that we did, and why were we where we were. Then we'll get into the historical context, looking at specifically like the history of Mexico and where that is, and then the Chicano Park, which is where our journey at the border started, and border militarization and a little bit of the history of that. Then we'll talk about our group's personal journey to the border. We had two groups that went with us. We were one group and we split into two. Half of us stayed on the San Diego side and another group went to Mexico to the Tijuana side. We'll chat a little bit about our time in Los Angeles and the groups that are organizing there. And then we have a couple ways that you can take action, and we'll have some space for questions at the end, okay? So we are MIRAC. MIRAC is an all-volunteer, grassroots, biracial, and binational immigrant rights organization here in Minnesota. We fight for legalization for all, an end to immigration raids and deportation, and an end to all anti-immigrant laws, and full equality in all areas of life. Snaps to that. And this is how we get work done. MIRAC carries out activist campaigns to protest and change unjust immigration laws and policies. We organize communities and support individuals and families impacted by those laws and policies. And as MIRAC, we are part of the Legalization for All network, which is a network of immigrant rights, just like MIRAC, all over the country. And it is all local Black grassroots immigrant rights organizations that demand legalization for all, no border, no wall, and no militarization of the border, no guest workers, program expansion, and the end of repression at the border and in the workplace. And this is the group from MIRAC that went down to the border. This is us when we were at the airport. We, as part of the Legalization for All network, went to meet with organizers and coalition partners in Los Angeles. We met with groups who are also from Chicago, and we spent 5 days at the southern border and in Tijuana learning about the border crisis.
So the stuff happening in the border now, it is not just arise right now. It's got a history like everything. And so I'm gonna hope you'll indulge me for a minute, not too long, to go through some of that history that leads us to where we are now with the situation at the border. And as you can see from that map, the borders that exist now have not always existed. In fact, they haven't existed for that long. In 1848, this is what the map looked like before 1848. Of course, all of this is on top of indigenous peoples and lands. So that's the first thing that should be acknowledged, that this is all indigenous land. That said, in 1848, before 1848, Mexico included what is now most of the southwestern United States. In 1848, what happened? The US invaded Mexico militarily, went to the Mexico City, basically literally at gunpoint, negotiated for Mexico to give up the top half of its country to form what's now the southwestern states of the US through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that essentially the people who were part of Mexico became people trapped on the other side of the border, where, you know, there's you may have heard the slogan, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's literally what happened. So I'm going to jump around, not give you what happened every year, but, jumping ahead, US immigration policies from the beginning were white supremacist and explicitly Eurocentric and white supremacist. So like, the first major immigration law was the Chinese Exclusion Act, literally to exclude people from China. And it continued from there. Jumping ahead to the 1990s, we saw NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which basically bankrupted a lot of Mexican agricultural workers, forcing them to migrate either to the cities in Mexico or, in the case of a lot of people, northward to the US to be able to make a living. And so you saw a wave of migration happening in the 1990s. In response to that, the Clinton administration started to build the walls in the major sort of ports of entry, like Tijuana, like in, I'm blanking on the name, in Arizona, where we went on our last delegation. And that started sort of the modern time of building the wall as we know it now. There were also major wars happening in Central America that were in large part provoked by the US supporting right-wing military regimes in those countries, which also provoked a lot of migration northward. So basically, I talked about the Clinton administration going forward under Bush, under Obama, under Trump, and now under Biden. They certainly, all of them have maybe different ways of talking about what they're doing. Some are a little harsher or a lot harsher in how they talk about immigrants, and some talk good talk. But through all of those administrations, the militarization of the border has increased. The number of deportations continues to increase, regardless of whether they're Democratic or Republican administrations. And so that mass deportations and border militarization has continued to increase and is continuing to do that now under the Biden administration. So that kind of leads us to the situation we have now.
And one of our first stops when we got to the border was Chicano Park, which I'm going to give you another just mini history lesson. But this is a mural that's painted at Chicano Park. And Chicano Park was not always a park. In the 1960s, the Department of Transportation put a freeway straight through this vibrant neighborhood in San Diego. And shortly thereafter promised the residents of the neighborhood that don't worry, we put this freeway through, but we're going to give you a park later. Okay. And that was in the 1960s. In April of 1970, they tried to actually backtrack on that promise and said, you know what, never mind, this is a freeway. We're going to actually use this land for a California Highway Patrol station. And at that point, the community stood up and said, absolutely not. This is our neighborhood, this is our park, and we are claiming this land, which even just saying that gives me goosebumps. And I'm sure many of you out there as activists are feeling that like community power. And they occupied the space. So they came to that space that they wanted to turn into this community or this patrol station, and they occupied it, and they tied themselves to the bulldozers and said absolutely not. And in 1971, the park was in fact given to the community. And what you can see behind is that one of the ways that the community really showed up was through artwork, and started almost immediately painting murals. What we noticed walking around was that many of the murals from the 1970s have in fact been like either revamped, but many of them have been painted over to show the history, and that's what this is representing. You can see kind of the history of the neighborhood, but also the history of the Chicano movement in general. We can get the next one. And something that was really neat about our time at Chicano Park was that we saw many generations of the Chicano power movement. And it started with, we started with the older gentleman who was in the first picture, kind of telling us about his time. And he was actually there when they were occupying the neighborhood and getting the park. And then it kind of moved down through the generations. So this man actually is really important in the community because he has both a store and he helps out. There's like a museum center now that's at the center of the park. And so he helps organize that space. So he was giving us a little bit of the background of the history from his perspective as well. And then we ended with going into the museum and actually the youth were there. And it was mostly college students who were organizing. And they were telling us about how the park is used today, which we saw when we were there. When we first got there, it was Palm Sunday and there was a Catholic mass happening and people were singing outside in the center at this kiosco, which is like this centerpiece, and it's kind of modeled after like an Aztec design. So it was just neat seeing the history being used today and how the community is claiming this space and how they're using it. And then I spent all day there. So by the time I left, there was a lowrider festival and there was music, and it was just really neat to see the community showing up in this space. And so the next slide shows inside of that museum that they have at the center of the park, they've held on to a lot of these artifacts. And many of them you might recognize. We have Che Guevara pins and pins from the grape strike. And it was just really neat to hear the young people, the youth, showing us these and telling us about how important they were.
Yeah, so what is border militarization and how does the wall militarize the border? So essentially the ultimate function of the wall is not to stop people from crossing legally, but to make sure that where you cross is so dangerous that you're likely to die. Many immigrants cross through really dangerous deserts where there's lack of access to food and water. And our government calls this prevention through deterrence. So basically, so these are kind of ways that the wall itself creates a militarized situation at the border. So like the height of the wall, the location of the wall, razor wire, and border patrol surveillance, which you'll hear more about all these bullet points in the rest of the presentation. And the photo on the left side over there is an actual photo we took during our trip. And this was a picture through the wall in Tijuana at Friendship Park, which you'll hear about later. But the arrow is pointing to a surveillance tower, which you'll hear more about on the next slide. So that surveillance tower is actually comes from Elbit Systems. And what Elbit Systems is Israel's largest weapons manufacturer. So it's essentially the main agent of Israeli apartheid against Palestinians, but it also supplies surveillance technology to the US-Mexico border, just like the one that we saw in the previous photo. And Minnesota, like why is this important to the presentation, is that Minnesota currently invests in Elbit Systems. This money comes from retirement money, like teachers, educators are a big group of people who retirement funds are invested in Elbit Systems. And yeah, so there have been, you know, the community is organized around getting Minnesota to divest from Elbit Systems for a long time now, and the fight is continuing. And this is a little outdated, not before May, but actually yesterday at the State Board of Investments meeting, we did have a member, Mari, who's sitting in the back table over there. Yeah. And Mari spoke, testified, you know, demanding that that the State Board of Investments divest from Elbit Systems, and gave a really powerful testimony about when she went on the border delegation with MIRAC a few years before that. Yeah. Okay, that's me, sorry.
Okay, so I was in the group from MIRAC that stayed on the US side. And this is our journey to the border. Something that I'd just like you to think about is, soon after when I speak, the side on Mexico is gonna talk about their journey to the border. So just thinking about the comparison between these two stories. For us, there was a lot of flooding. Nature was just in nature. And so you can see that up to the border there, it's not, it's like a nature reserve. I believe it's a state park. Technically at this point, the park was closed, but it's why we were and all the way across the country. So we did in fact make our way to the border. You can see why it was closed because it's absolutely flooded. None of the trails were usable. So we had to go a little rogue, and went, around on the trails. There was kind of a grassy area that we walked through. And I stravaed it. It was like a 2-mile hike through the grass and back. So it's not close to any part of civilization. It's very hidden away. And something that was interesting is that while we were walking through this state park, the whole time we were very clearly being surveyed, and people knew that we were there because there were helicopters going overhead. You can see that in front of this, like in front of the border, there's a road and you could see vans and cars going up and down it from the border. And then we had one thing that was really powerful to me was that when we did make it there, we had a moment of silence for people who have suffered crossing this border. And so it was really powerful to, through this like kind of weird and wet and muddy journey, to when we did make it to the border, to have just a moment to really reflect on why we were there. And this shows how we feel about the border and the border militarization.
So crossing into Tijuana as sort of a juxtaposed experience. We were in the car and we went through this checkpoint. And it actually was not too challenging for us to just drive through straight to Mexico, which you'll see the difference between coming into Mexico and then trying to come into the US from Mexico. It's a very stark difference in terms of the level of difficulty, the length of time that it takes, surveillance, etc. I will say, like, when we tried to take these photos, we did get chastised by a Border Patrol agent who said, like, you're not allowed to take photographs or record, but at the same time, then she was like, it's fine. And then we just went through, and it was pretty seamless.
Did they search your phones or equipment or something?
No, they didn't. They just said, delete, we need you to delete those photos.
They didn't even check our passports.
They didn't check our passports. I remember this for like when we were talking about going back into the US from Mexico. Yeah. Oh, it's still me. Okay. So when we first got to Tijuana, the group that was traveling to Tijuana, we were taken on a tour by this person here, Roberto. And he works for the Deported Veterans Project. He's a veteran himself, and he was deported himself. And now he works for this project that basically helps veterans who've been deported, because as it turns out, even though as a veteran who's not, as it turns out, even though as a veteran you can participate in war, that does not protect you from being deported. So for instance, like if you're like a legal permanent resident and then you go to war, you sustain all this trauma and PTSD, you might be more likely, as Roberto was conveying to us, you might be more likely to end up at some point in the criminal justice system, having suffered great trauma, for instance, like a DUI or something like that, even something fairly minor. And then when you go to apply for your citizenship, after being a resident for the proper number of years, that can flag you when you're applying to be a citizen, and then put you at risk for deportation. And so I think it's notable that like the US like allows people to serve in the army, but then still does not protect them. And these are just more photos of the office for deported veterans. It's a really like strong community in Tijuana that they've created to support veterans who've been deported. And Roberto talked about like also, even if you were not born in Mexico, like all these people get deported to Mexico and then have to like live there, not even in their home country of origin. And then have to just like, for Roberto, he's from San Diego, so just like looking across the wall, so close yet so far to like all of his family. It's a really painful experience.
Yeah, so after Roberto brought us to the Deported Veterans Center, he drove us just a couple miles down the road to Friendship Park. And what Friendship Park is it's a binational park located close to the border crossing. So there's a San Diego side and a Tijuana side, and it's a park that is separated by the wall. But essentially, it used to be open on both sides, and you kind of saw from Sophie's slides a little bit earlier that they couldn't even get to the wall on the US side. But on the Tijuana side, it is still open, it's still a park. But before that, it was a meeting place for separated families to come, and they could, you know, reach and touch each other through the wall, through the bars in the wall, and like have a picnic or exchange gifts, things like that. But the US side was closed under Trump and remains closed under Biden still. So there is strong organizing efforts in San Diego to get the park reopened. And so we learned a little bit about that as well while we were there. And so this is just a picture of the wall, the park, and then you'll see more pictures later, but it's actually on a beach. So yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is a photo from our drive from the Deported Veterans Center to Friendship Park. And so during the drive, as you can see, we saw out our window two parallel walls. So if you can see, like, these are two sets of walls. And what our tour guide told us was that asylum seekers are actually given a lot of misinformation about how to apply for asylum, and they're kind of told that they can just go to the border and apply. And so in reality, you need an appointment, and those are difficult to get, and it's a whole long process. But because of this misinformation, many immigrants actually would jump the first wall, and families, you know, it's a whole thing to scale a wall and be able to make it to the other side. So they would go and try to give themselves up to Border Patrol and ask for asylum, but they were actually just left there, and like there's no food and water, and it's hot. And we actually, while we were driving, Roberto pointed out, like, we saw some families that were like in between the two walls. So yeah, pretty much what he said was that this is like a torture on display tactic that's used to discourage immigrants from crossing, which is pretty just horrific. If you want to go to the next slide. So these are some more photos from Friendship Park. You can kind of see the beach area here. And so the vibe there is kind of like a lot of their families playing. It was definitely kind of like a touristy area, like a boardwalk, food. There's kids and people playing and swimming in the water. But obviously, like, in the middle of this whole environment, there's this wall that actually, if you can see from the picture, stretches out not only to the water, but into the water, like pretty far into the water. And what our tour guide told us was that this was because a group of people attempted to swim across once, like a large group of people, and a few were successful. So they just kind of kept extending the wall through the water to make it more dangerous to swim across and like push kind of further out into the ocean. And not only that, but they put barbed wire under the water as well. So it's like extremely dangerous to cross there. And this kind of, I don't know if any of you heard more recently on the Texas border, they've actually put buoys into the water with like razor. Yes. So this is like not, I guess, I mean, obviously this is a different situation, but it's pretty similar, and they're, you know, just doing what they can to make this like extremely dangerous. So yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. This is a little video as well as a photo of the wall. If you want to play the video, this is kind of just a little clip that we took.
I'm not.
It's not gonna work. It's not that.
No, I just can't see the mouse.
Oh, there it is.
You got it.
It's just a short clip that kind of shows you like the beach Here's the wall, here's the beach. You can kind of get an idea of what it's like there. And so another thing I want to say about the wall itself is that, our tour guide Roberto told us that he kind of asked us the question, you know, why do you think that the wall is 30 feet high? So and he pointed out there were some parts of the wall that were still 18 feet, but that more parts of the wall were being built up to 30 feet specifically. And he asked us, like, why do you think that is? And his answer was that 30 feet is actually like the critical height that if you fall from it, you would be severely injured or not make it. So that was like a calculated, and it's also like more difficult to breathe when you get up higher. So that was like the answer for why much of the wall is being built up from that 18 feet to 30 feet. So if you want to go to the next. And this picture is in the park itself. There was a border church, and we actually got to see the end of this happening when we were there. So pretty much on Sundays, there's groups that come there and provide free meals to immigrants and those who need meals at Friendship Park. And they're what's known as the Migrant Kitchen, and they actually partner with Casa de Luz, which you'll hear more about from Julia in a little bit, where we went next.
So this image is just showing kind of the difference between the two sides, as well as the people on the Mexico side found that from the picture we had taken, so this was us at the state park, you could actually see the Airbnb where they were staying on the Tijuana side, which I think I was, yeah, is that image, that building right there. So you can see that on the US side, there is a vast separation between civilization and the border wall, whereas in Mexico, it's a city all the way up to that border wall, and yeah, just that stark difference.
Hello, Miguel.
Hello,
Yeah, I'm just here. I wrote this piece just from, we're getting a lot of information, a lot of facts, but a lot of other people from the delegation on both sides found it hard to describe the humanity and like the kind of pure evilness of it. The essence, it kind of just like drives you to a place that's like really dark, even if it's Mexico and there's a beach and people having enchiladas and tacos, or a national park. I wrote this piece just to describe that a little bit. 12:30. Yeah, air struggled to weave across the space between the bars as it too was to yield. Each of its bars taunting your spirit, draining your defenses, its pull on you endless. Nature asked permission in its presence as if it spared in the dealings of placement. Splitting the earth and demanding the sea to partner in its mission, the sea bowing by omission, drowning by description. Sunbathed and yet had two shadows, reaching on both sides, pulling and pushing back and forth. Its crossers daring to touch its shadows, often are claimed by it. It's 30 feet reaching into the sky, risen so you would not. It's calculated inception so you could not.
Okay, so just like we talked about how there was resistance that was happening in Chicano Park, there's also some really beautiful like resistance and community care that's happening on the Tijuana side. So one example of this is that we all traveled to this place called Casa de Luz, which was founded by Irving Mondragon and also helped out by Via International, Via Migrante. And this place, it serves LGBTQIA migrants who need a place to stay. And Irving was involved in the organizing of the 2018 and 2019 migrant caravans from Central America. He started a food program called Camp Hope to provide food for the people that were camped out along the border. And then this specific place was inaugurated last August, and since they've started, they've hosted 7,500 people. They've had people from Central America, they've had people from Ukraine and Russia, really migrants from all over the place. And they provide housing, food, shelter, medical care, emotional support, and also help applying for asylum as well. Sorry, I forgot to take the mask off. They focus really a lot on food security as well, and community healthy eating. And so kind of taking that Camp Hope, providing meals at the border and bringing it here. So something that's really unique about this place is that it provides housing for however long you need to stay there. So a lot of the other shelters available are like limited time housing. Sometimes you even have to pay to stay there. And here there's really no limit on how long you can stay. You can also come back. And there are people that have chosen to come back to continue to serve that community. And they really do like intentional community building. So you can look at this. And something I forgot to mention as well is that even though the Mexican government sends lots of LGBTQIA migrants to that shelter, they are not recognized as, or they don't have shelter status. And so that means that they like have really struggled to get a commercial kitchen license, and other things that would be supportive and helpful for them. So that's like a contradiction that the Mexican government recognizes they're providing this service, but is not willing to like officially recognize them or fund them. And I actually misspoke because as you can see, they do not consider themselves a shelter. Irving is very intentional about the language that he uses. It's a collective, it's not a shelter. That word is so ingrained in me and in all of us that like it just slips out, and that's not the model. So it's because it's like a community space, to the point where they host like all these different like artists to come in, programming, classes, and so it's designed to be a community space that all the different members contribute to, not a shelter. Yeah. And these are just some more photos of us in front of Casa de Luz. It looks really beautiful there. That's the inside of it's like a living common space area. And that's the outside. There's lots of beautiful murals. Yes.
So then these are a few photos from when we were crossing back into the US, which was the next morning. So it took us about 2 hours in pretty much standstill traffic. So cars just kind of like fully standing still, trying to get through the border. And actually, one of the organizers from LA who was with us had said that she was there recently, and when she tried to cross back, like this was actually a pretty mild day. Like it took them 8 hours to get back across.
Whoa.
So as you can see, very different than what you heard from Julia earlier about how we entered without even showing passports in like 10 minutes. So yeah, pretty much, here's just a photo of like there are vendors kind of along the side of the road selling things, but you know, it's very standstill, like you're not moving at all. And that is, yeah, this is the van we drove through in, and they did check our passports going back into the US as well. Yeah, so as you can see, pretty much just a very big contrast from going back into the US rather than when we went into Tijuana.
And I think it's important to note too, that like, some of the other MIRAC members that were with us that had traveled like back through the US side with family members who were not US citizens, but held like other forms of status, said that like our trip back went a lot smoother because we were all US citizens and like a lot faster, and that was like nothing like they had experienced before when they were with mixed status folks in the car. So that's like another thing where US citizenship equals a lot of privilege.
Yeah, so as was mentioned before, delegation was organized by the Legalization for All Network, and the local group in LA is Centro CSO. And so they put together this panel during the delegation that we participated on with a lot of different organizations that they work with in LA and Southern California. And so I was basically told to be the person speaking for Legalization for All Network on that. So I did. And it was really, really cool just to hear all of the different organizing going on in Southern California to, fight for immigrant rights and fight against border militarization. And you can see some of the other organizations that were on the panel. I won't do it justice trying to, explain what every group does, but it was, I was really inspired by the range of organizing and the really cool stuff that people are doing under these really hard circumstances.
And during our last day in Los Angeles, we met with some youth who were immigrants from Guatemala at a community space at SALIF. It's the Salvadoran American Leadership and Education Fund. And in that space, we spoke with all immigrants who had immigrated in the last 8 months. And they brought two things to our attention. First of all, they were students, and so they shared with us this beautiful painting that they have that shows the connection between, they were all from Guatemala. So this side of the mural or the picture is Guatemala and represents their home. And this side represents LA. And it shows the things crossing between the two, the bird, the quetzal, that is the Guatemalan bird going between the two spaces. And it was just really neat to hear them kind of explain this and explain the connections. But one thing that they did bring up, many of them, Spanish is actually not their first language. Quiche is, which is an indigenous language. And they talked about the difficulty of finding translators and getting documentation and things translated to their native language in a way that they understood. I'm a teacher here in Minneapolis, and that's something that's true here as well. We have many students where I teach that are from Ecuador and are also indigenous, and Spanish is not their first language, and they often get things handed to them in Spanish because people are like, oh, Ecuador, here you go. And they don't understand it. So they may speak it as a second language, but it is not their native tongue. Something else that they spoke about was that many of them, if not all of them, had jobs as well. And they talked about the difficulty of being employees and students and the difficulty of balancing those two. And one of the people from the Legalization for All Network actually is their teacher and was talking to kind of joking with a couple of them about how they fall asleep in class. And the students were just saying, yes, it is so hard to be working full time and trying to balance that with school and just the difficulty of that. Not to mention the lack of labor laws for children who are working, which we don't know everything about. And so the less we know, the more scary I personally think it can be.
So we're coming to the end of our presentation. So some things that you can do if you feel so moved is to join MIRAC. You can organize locally for immigrant rights. We have meetings right here every Thursday at 7 p.m. And you can also donate to us if you'd like at MIRAC, Minnesota. However, if you want to go to the next slide. On the next slide, here is the QR code to actually support Casa de Luz. Oh yeah, here's the QR code to support Casa de Luz. If you feel compelled to give, things have only gotten really worse at the border in recent months, like increased militarization. And so I'm sure that Irving and all the folks at Casa de Luz really appreciate any money that we can send their way as well. And also Tifa is coming around to collect donations. So,
Which will go to both Casa de Luz and MIRAC, yeah.
yeah.
So thank you so much for coming today to our presentation. We also have a little time for any questions that you have. Does anyone have any?